So welcome to part 4 or 5 of the ECGI annual conference. So for those of you who've just joined, we had the business meeting before, and we now turn to the next important part of the day, which is to honor the 2 best papers in our 2 working paper series, the Finance and the Law series. And as I explained this morning at the business meeting, this is really one of the pillars of what we do. We produced more than 140 working papers last year, and the editors of the 2 series have chosen 2 papers that they think are the best papers, which means that they are academically extremely good, but they also chose them because they think that they are particularly relevant. So we have 2 prizes. One is the Law Prize, which is going to be would have been presented by Amir Licht, who's the editor of the Law series. Now, Amir is a professor at Reichman University, and he would have had to fly here from Tel Aviv. Now, I don't have to explain to you what's going on in the Middle East, so he could not fly here today. We are thinking of him and everybody who's involved or who is suffering from what is going on in the Middle East. And I'm very grateful that Luca Enriques has agreed to give out the Law Prize. Luca was the editor of the Law series before Amir, so I think Luca knows how this works. And we then, in sequence, turn to the Finance Prize, which is going to be presented not by Mike Burkhardt, the editor of the series, but by I will stand in for Mike, and I will do this with the other Marco from Intesa Sanpaolo, and that will follow. So Luca, may I invite you up to the podium to present the Law Prize.
So no surprise, as you can see, the winner is Curtis Milhaupt. But let me take this opportunity, first of all, to thank everyone who has attended this excellent event and who's attending this session. Let me also thank and congratulate both prize winners and the key speakers. Special thanks go to our sponsors who make the ECGI possible, and especially Intesa Sanpaolo, who's sponsoring the Finance Working Paper Prize. You may notice that the Law Prize is up for grabs. And if there's anyone who's willing to sponsor it in the audience, please come forward, and next year your name will be on the slide. Very, very special thanks to Ellen McPartland, Suzanne Harley, and Asif Malik for making the ECGI working paper series work like a Swiss clock, if that is still a metaphor that can be used. But also special thanks to Amir Licht, who has been so efficiently editing the series for, I think, 5 years now. And now the congratulations specifically to Curtis Milhaupt for winning the ECGI prize for the best paper in 2023 in the Law Working Paper series for his paper on the geopolitics of controlling shareholders. Curtis is not here, but he will soon appear in a video and present his paper himself. So let me just highlight a few points that I find important. The paper highlights how controlling shareholders are significant political players who can influence both national and international affairs. The first line of the paper is, Elon Musk has been called a geopolitical chaos agent, which is clearly a very current anecdotal evidence of the paper's characterization of controlling shareholders, not just as wielding loads of managerial and corporate power, but also as political players. Though usually not as openly as Leon Musk, as Donald Trump called him 1 month ago, but still behind the scenes they are indeed powerful. And current geopolitics apart, and here I quote, "What sets this paper apart is not only its intellectual depth, but also its practical implications. By examining the geopolitical dimensions of corporate control, Professor Milhaupt has opened up new avenues for research and policy considerations. His work challenges us to think beyond traditional boundaries and consider the far-reaching consequences of corporate governance decisions in a global context." Where is this quote from? As you may guess, it's from an AI chat box, Claude AI to be specific. So with the help of AI, that was my introduction to Curtis' own presentation of his paper, and we can all congratulate Curtis virtually for his excellent paper. Thank you.
Hello everyone, greetings from California. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person for the ECGI annual meeting, but it's truly an honor to have my paper selected as the ECGI's best working paper in law for 2023. So what follows is a short presentation on the paper, as well as a very brief preview of a more recent working paper on a related theme, corporate governance in an era of geoeconomics, which I just posted to SSRN. So as everyone at this meeting, I think, is well aware, there's a long and very important line of literature on controlling shareholders. Now, the focus of that scholarship is, of course, the agency conflict between the controller and the minority shareholders, and a problem that manifests itself in a phenomenon today that's known as tunneling. This is the extraction of wealth by the controlling shareholder from the minority, either using a series of related party transactions or a one-time grab of wealth through a major transaction like a merger. Now, a more recent perspective is that controllers may need a certain amount of leeway from market pressure to advance their idiosyncratic vision. This is a special idea that they have for the growth of their firm that may be difficult for outsiders to evaluate. So they need control in order to give themselves and their plan time to reach fruition. So this is a more positive spin on controlling shareholders and its impact on firm wealth. And of course, there's now a burgeoning literature on the pros and cons of control via dual-class share structures. These are shares, multiple classes of shares, one of which has multiple votes, and the other of which has low or no votes, and the founder controls the multiple voting shares. Again, this raises agency cost problems. Okay, now the key point is that all of this literature focuses on the within-firm wealth consequences of controlling shareholders framed by an agency cost analysis. The simple insight of my paper is to point out that this vast literature has an obvious blind spot. The fact that controlling shareholders wield significant power, not only in their firms, but also within their home country's political system. So think of the Lee family and Samsung in Korea and its generations-long influence on Korean politics. And increasingly, they even wield significant influence in geopolitics. Think, for example, of the role of Elon Musk's Starlink in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, you may say that this is really not a new phenomenon, and indeed it's not. Corporations have exercised political and even geopolitical influence for centuries. So it's fair to ask, why is it important to consider political and geopolitical influence of controlling shareholders now? And perhaps even more to the point, why should corporate governance scholars care about this, as opposed to, say, political scientists or international relations scholars? I think this additional perspective on controlling shareholders is important now for two reasons. First, we're in an era of great concern for the externalities of corporate activity on a broad array of stakeholders, well beyond the wealth impact on shareholders. Political and geopolitical influence is clearly an externality with major potential impact on national populations and even on relations among states. Second, and relatedly, as we all know, corporations are some of the most important actors in the world today, and there's heightened concerns about the national security implications of global corporate activity, a subject that I'll return to later on in the presentation. So corporate governance scholars, I should say, should have something to say about the political and geopolitical influence of controlling shareholders, because the mechanisms by which a government or an individual controls a corporation are fundamentally a product of corporate corporate law and corporate governance. And of course, issues of corporate ownership and control, which today loom so large in national security policies, are of course the bread and butter of corporate law scholarship. So after starting with this basic observation, the first move in the paper is to explore the power of corporate control beyond the agency cost framework. And in my view, the power of corporate control represents a fusion of both economic and political power. Now, the mechanisms by which that fusion is deployed, of course, depends on the type of controller, whether it be the state, a founding family dynasty, or an individual entrepreneur. Now, one comment I received in earlier drafts of this paper was that, gosh, CEOs of dispersed ownership firms are also very powerful. This is true, but I think that there's something distinctive about, say, Elon Musk as compared to, take, for example, Jamie Dimon. First, controlling shareholders by definition are less reliant on other corporate actors, such as the board of directors or other shareholders, to get their way in the corporation. And compared to the garden variety rich CEO, individual controllers, again like Musk, have vastly more personal wealth. They're often media or social media savvy, and maybe most importantly, they have what Weber called charisma. Not personal charisma, and personally I don't think Musk has much of that, but they do have a strong sense of mission and an ability to recruit people to buy into that mission. I think also often there's a kind of symbiosis between the state and the firm, with influence potentially running in both directions. So for example, an SOE can carry out a government's policy, but it can also capture the state for its own benefit. Family-controlled business groups provide jobs, exports, and so on that benefit the state, and in return, they often receive protection in the form of favorable labor laws, lax antitrust enforcement, and weak shareholders' rights. Or think of the platform economies. They have benefited greatly from government investment in the internet and legal protection they receive for material posted on their platforms. The government has also benefited from technological innovations in the internet, and politicians themselves are major users and beneficiaries of social media. Now, turning to some examples. In the next section of the paper, I illustrate the point that multiple forms of corporate capitalism feature controlling shareholders, and each one illustrates in a different way the political and/or geopolitical influence of the controller and their firm. Now, the most obvious example is, of course, the state capitalism, featuring the state-owned enterprise. There's a direct connection between the government and the corporation, a kind of blend of state and commercial activity. And the rise of China, obviously in a model that relied heavily on SOEs, at least in its early stages, resuscitated the SOE as an economic and indeed state actor at a time when it appeared to be consigned to the dustbin of history. A mutant spin-off of the SOE is what I call in the paper klepto-oligarchic capitalism in Russia, where companies like Gazprom that have been weaponized for strategic purposes are ostensibly controlled by individual oligarchs, though ultimately, of course, control lies with Putin himself. A second example is the family-controlled conglomerate that's prevalent in developmental capitalism. So again, think of the Samsung Group and the extraordinary political influence of the Lee family. Multiple members of the Lee family have been convicted of corruption and then ultimately pardoned, quote unquote, in the national interest. So as if Samsung was so important to the Korean economy that these people had to be let out of jail in order to continue leading these firms. These conglomerates also wield significant influence in shaping the domestic institutional environment in their own interest. And this is true wherever these conglomerates are present, including Brazil, Mexico, Korea, etc. A third, and perhaps less obvious example, is what has come to be known as surveillance capitalism. These are platform economies featuring the likes of Meta/Facebook, Google, and Alibaba. All of the key players in this platform economy are firms with controlling shareholders, and they wield significant power in their domestic political economies, at times to the significant concern of their home governments. Think of the controversy over Zuckerberg and Facebook's influence on U.S. elections, or think of Jack Ma's travails in China after he criticized the government. Now, in the final section of the paper, I consider some of the important policy domains and policy issues that are implicated when one broadens the perspective on controlling shareholders beyond agency costs and the risk of tunneling. So the first, and I think most important, is national security. The link between corporate control and national security has never been more salient, and it's a topic of considerable interest to me. The rise of China in particular has heightened concern over issues of corporate control, whether it be the activities of SOEs or the fear that the Chinese Communist Party is influencing private firms and their controllers. One exercise that I conducted in the paper is to investigate the ownership and control of firms on the U.S. government's list of so-called Chinese military companies. These are companies that, at least according to the U.S. government, are ostensibly civilian in their orientation, but that actually work and collaborate closely with the Chinese military. What I discovered is that most of them have controlling shareholders who range from the state itself, in the form of an SOE, to private firms explicitly linked to the government and military, to private firms whose individual founders emerged from a background in government or the military and received state support at an early stage of their firm's growth. I think national security policy is really only catching up with the reality that the power of corporate control has vast implications for the acquisition and exercise of state power. I'm going to skip economic sanctions and stock exchange competition in the interest of time. Let me just say a very brief word on stock exchange competition. As we all know, the stock exchanges today are competing greatly for listings. Oftentimes they're competing to list companies with controlling shareholders. So for example, think about the attempt to list and lower standards, listing standards to list Saudi Aramco. Let me move now to dual class shares. As I said at the outset, there's a great deal of debate about the corporate governance implications of dual-class capitalization structures. But there has been no discussion of whether these structures promote the creation of firms that distort the political economy. So I think there's a disconnect between antitrust scholars concerned about the political power of the big tech companies, the so-called neo-Brandeisian school of antitrust, and corporate governance scholars focused on agency problems arising from dual-class shares. So the simple but important point is that dual-class share structures are the mechanism by which the tech company founders have achieved control over their companies. I think more attention should be paid to this point, the political implications of creating founders using dual-class structures. Finally, let me say a word about ESG. Obviously a huge topic today. I think there's largely an unstudied connection between firms with controlling shareholders and the effort to make corporations more concerned with environmental, social, and governance issues, to be more responsible capitalists, if you will. For example, one question, are firms with controlling shareholders more or less likely to have a regard for corporate externalities? There's no clear answer to this question from a theoretical perspective. Controlling shareholders may have significant concern for externalities if they care about the long-term reputation of their families, for example. But on the other hand, they may use their influence to stymie the adoption of laws and regulations to curb GHG emissions or other social harms. Or take the case of the SOE. As an arm of the state, it may be an effective tool for carrying out climate policy or mitigating other social harms. Yet they may also be corrupt or lacking in market discipline necessary to curb harmful externalities. So there's a need, I think, for fine-grained analysis of this question. One final point I'll raise here. I think an underappreciated aspect of the call for corporations to do more to solve big social issues like climate change and inequality is that corporations, many of which may wind up having controlling shareholders, heeding this call will inevitably take on even greater political influence, something that may or may not be in the best long-term interests of society. All right, now very briefly, let me say a word about a recent project that I've just posted to SSRN called Corporate Governance in an Era of Geoeconomics. We're now quite far removed from the turn-of-the-century euphoria over globalization and the so-called end of history for corporate law and governance. We've entered into an era now sometimes referred to as geoeconomics. This is the use of economics for political ends and to enhance the power of the state. We're clearly seeing this most clearly in efforts to decouple or de-risk from China. Corporations are now on the front lines of geoeconomics, particularly since governments are increasingly reliant on private sector actors for the technologies that drive every facet of our lives and are crucial to the technological innovation and national defense. Private corporations now face a dense thicket of tech transfer restrictions, economic sanctions, and supply chain complexities resulting primarily from the U.S. geopolitical rivalry with China. So this paper is a first step in exploring the implications of geoeconomics for U.S. corporations. Now, obviously geoeconomics affects corporations around the world, but I'm focusing here on U.S. corporations. So in the paper, I document the rising geopolitical risks facing U.S. corporations by looking at the risk factor sections of Form 10K, and I explore how national security concerns may affect both the policy environment for corporate governance and firm-level corporate governance. As to the first question, I see several policy implications that overlap somewhat with the ESG movement. At a basic level, geopolitics or geoeconomics is being added to the formidable list of major issues that boards are being asked to consider in running their firms. The government is now a major stakeholder of every company whose operations have national security implications, and that's many companies. And as with ESG itself, sometimes taking national security issues into consideration is directly aligned with the firm's business interests, and at times there may be tension between the national interest and the shareholders' interest. I then ask whether boards have the expertise to assess and mitigate those risks, and to explore other dimensions of the issue, from compliance to securities law disclosures and beyond. So thank you very much for your attention. I welcome any thoughts you may have, suggestions or criticisms. Just please reach out to me by email. I look forward to the opportunity to seeing all of you in person at GCGC in London. Bye for now.